Good morning. Those of you who might not know me, my name is Peter. I'm the curate here at St. Paul's, and we are continuing in this series on Moses and the Exodus. If you were here a couple of weeks ago, then you saw the beginning to the series, and what we're sort of doing is saying, actually, as we seek to be increasingly courageous for Christ as a church, and as we are seeking to follow God's call in our life, whatever that may be, what are the sort of different tropes, patterns, occurrences that happen as someone seeks to be honest to God's call on their life and to courageously follow God's call on their life? And so we're looking at Moses, and what we saw in the first week is that Moses has this sort of unique identity. He's both a Hebrew, but he is also being raised in the Egyptian household. And so he has this sort of intersection of belonging to this people who are enslaved in Egypt, but also being raised in the royal household of the government that is enslaving these people. And it's in this sort of intersection, this unique person that Moses is, that his sort of unique call is going to sort of bubble up. And so we wanted to think a little bit more about what are our sort of unique intersections in us. God already has one of everybody else, and he wants one of you, and has made you and has situated you in a particular place and in a particular way for a particular purpose. And so in the next week, last week, we saw how maybe this call of Moses's was beginning to bubble up. He saw the oppression of the Hebrews. He saw the mistreatment that the Egyptians imposed upon the Hebrews. And in that call, that holy discontent, some might say, or that righteous anger was beginning to bubble up. And he sort of took things into his own hands as he killed the Egyptian slave driver. And oftentimes, when we're seeking to follow God's call, or when we're in those early stages of discerning call, and we have this sort of holy discontent or a righteous anger for something in the world, or something in our lives, in our community, in our family, it's not uncommon that our first port of call is to do things in our own strength. And it's not uncommon that when we do that, we sort of can make a mess of things. And so Moses ends up fleeing Egypt and fleeing out to Midian and becoming a bit of a refugee. And it's not uncommon in our life and in our journey of faith and discipleship that after a significant failure, we might find ourselves feeling a bit in the wilderness, feeling a bit lost, feeling a bit of a spare part. I've ruined it. I've ruined my potential to fulfill what may have been God's call in my life. And so I will just sort of sit back and just sort of ride it out. And maybe by God's grace, I'll still get into heaven and that'll be okay. And this passage in Exodus chapter 3 tells us that no matter what our foul up happens to be, no matter what, God's call is God's call. And we want to see how that takes place. And so we start in chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And here I just want to make a quick note. God is adding tributaries to the river that is Moses. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about how we all have our different life circumstances. And Moses was a Hebrew, but he was raised in the Egyptian household. And this sort of intersection, there were sort of tributaries that all fed into this river that would be Moses' life and how he would live out his call. And now, Moses is adding to his life, or God rather, is adding to Moses' experience, that of being a shepherd. Which would be a very humbling thing for a man raised in the Egyptian royal household. Shepherds were the sort of lowliest of occupations in ancient Egypt. And here he is. He's raised in in Pharaoh's household, finds himself a refugee on the far side of the desert, tending sheep. And maybe you felt that way. You thought, I have blown it, and now I'm in the wilderness, and this is just my lot now. This is God's holy discipline on my stupidity. But actually what God is doing is adding to Moses' life the experiences necessary to fulfill the call that he will have on him. Because what will Moses do other than shepherd God's people through the wilderness after they are liberated by God's mighty hand from Egypt? So what we see is actually, even when we think we've blown it, even when we think that it's all done and whatever we thought might have been God's call on our life has to be just obliterated, God is actually continuing to add to our experiences that which we will need to fulfill the call that he has on our life. And from this place, Moses sees this bush that is on fire but isn't burning up. How peculiar. How peculiar. Now, for some of us, this becomes a stumbling block because we, for whatever reason, have decided that the miraculous doesn't happen. That which isn't discernible through the scientific method, that's the epistemology, that's the way we know the truth, is through the scientific method. And so if we can't understand it via the scientific method, it must be a myth, it must be an allegory, a metaphor, some sort of peculiarity to get our attention. But if we believe in a God who transcends the scientific method, it's really not a problem for us to conceive of something peculiar, like a bush being on fire but not burning up, actually happening. And this piques Moses' curiosity, as it would any of ours. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. Verse 3, so Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. And I wonder, has it ever been for you that God has piqued your curiosity with something unexpected? Has it ever been that you thought, what a strange conference that that most of St. Paul's go to every summer? I wonder what this is, new wine. Perhaps I shall go and see why it is so. This is strange, this course called Alpha that people go on. Perhaps I will go over and see what it is about. This is strange, this Bible in a year program that people would spend 20 minutes a day reading the ancient literature. Perhaps I shall go and see what it's all about. And God has a way of piquing our curiosity as he draws us to his call for us. And I wonder, maybe it's something to consider. Is God piquing your curiosity about something? Is there something strange, aside from a Yankee, sitting here with a dog collar on, in the room right now, that God is piquing your curiosity? That you need to go, what is that? And what is it all about? Anyway, carrying on. And from this curiosity, God calls Moses. Verse 4, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. And this little English phrase, here I am, is a spectacular Hebrew word. Oh, now I'm getting nerdy, but it's true. It's this Hebrew word, hanini, and it has the idea of reporting for duty. Here I am. I am ready for service. Here I am. And throughout, particularly the Old Testament, because that's the part of the Bible written mostly in Hebrew, this word hanini is to say, here I am ready. What is the order? Give the order so that I may go out and do it. And sometimes, before we are ready to encounter God's call on our life, it takes time. Moses is perhaps about 80 years old at this point in time. He's tried to deliver on that which is important to him, the holy discontent, the righteous anger in his heart. He's pursued that in his own strength. It's failed. He's in the wilderness. He's doing a lowly job, feeling perhaps quite a bit marginalized, feeling perhaps quite a bit like the prime of his life is done. What is it that he can do? He's messed it all up. And it's in that place of humility and brokenness and just sort of, you know what, it's not up to me, that God often finds us to say, and now you're ready. And Moses says, here I am. What do you have for me, Lord? What is the mission? What is the thing? What is the command? And for those of us who are thinking, yeah, here I am. But I don't oftentimes feel that bold. I don't oftentimes feel that ready. In many ways, and quite ironically, neither does Moses, because later on in verse 11, after God says, this is what I want you to do, Moses says to God, well, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Here I am. Who am I? And this courage to accept God's call is actually, even for Moses, quite a bit fragile. It's quite a bit unsteady. It's quite a bit unsure. And perhaps you're like me, and on many occasions you said, here I am, Lord, what would you like me to do? And you hear it and go, oh, not sure about that. I don't know I can do that. And surely, when Moses hears that God's call on him is to go and liberate the Israelites, the Hebrews, from slavery in Egypt, surely his flood of failures comes to the forefront of his mind. Who am I, God? I already tried to do that once. And it ended spectacularly wrongly. And now I'm a shepherd. I've got no regard. I've got no social, political, economic clout. I've got nothing to bring to the table. All I have are liabilities. Liabilities of my failures, liabilities of my really unimpressive current context. Who am I? And so if you're thinking today, I think there's something God wants me to do, but I just don't know that I can do it. Well, that's typical. That's quite typical. So actually be encouraged. Be encouraged. The other thing I want to note, just on the side, God says as often, he says, I have, in verse 7, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. It's also, at times, easy to think, when the thing that kind of stirs your holy discontent, your righteous anger, when nothing seems to be happening about it, it's not uncommon for us to think God just doesn't care. God, have you seen? God, do you know? God, do you care? Have you seen about these people in slavery? Have you heard about the Civil War? Have you heard about this starvation? God, do you know about my family? Do you know about my neighbor? God, do you even care about me? Do you even know? And God's saying, I know. And this is what I really want to needle in on. Because Moses is going to say, suppose I do go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? Verse 14, and God said to Moses, I am who I am. Tell them, the I am has sent you. There's something remarkable in this. God revealing in his name something of who he is and what he is like, that actually puts in context the reality that our failures of the past, whatever we think about ourselves and our situation in the present, whatever we're worried about in the future, whether or not we think God has ever cared about the thing that we care about because he hasn't acted yet, all of this gets put in context when God reveals that his name is I am who I am. when he reveals that he is I am. Now, there are a lot of different things that could be said about this name of God, Yahweh. It's a Hebrew word. And it simply is the verb for being. It simply is the verb for being. And what God is saying is, I just am. It's not that I was and I will be, I am. I'm completely outside of time. And I want to take just a little side trip because I think this is something that's very difficult for us to grasp. And I think that this is something that is of devastating importance. So, Stephen Hawking's last book, he didn't write it, it's kind of compiled on his behalf. Brief answers to the big questions. I thought I should pick it up. So I picked it up and I read it. I thought it would be important to read because the very first chapter asks the question, addresses the question, is there a God? This is Stephen Hawking's brief answer to the big question, is there a God? Now, among other things, he concludes the chapter like this, and pardon me as I read a little bit. As we travel back in time towards the moment of the Big Bang, the universe gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it finally comes to a point where the whole universe is a space so small that it is in effect a single infinitesimally small, infinitesimally dense black hole. And just as with modern-day black holes floating around in space, the laws of nature dictate something quite extraordinary. They tell us that here too, time itself must come to a stop. You can't get to a time before the Big Bang because there was no time before the Big Bang. We have finally found something that doesn't have a cause because there was no time for a cause to exist in. For me, this means that there is no possibility of a creator because there is no time for a creator to have existed in. Time didn't exist before the Big Bang, so there is no time for God to make the universe in. Seems quite reasonable. Seems quite rational. However, I would suggest that for all of his brilliance, Stephen Hawking in this particular case has missed out on something that even an A-level RE student would pick up on. And that is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who calls Moses to liberate his people out of Israel, is the I am. Stephen Hawking, and understandably so, is only seeing the world through the framework of the scientific method that he operates in. And the scientific method is confined to conceiving things within the created realm. Perhaps we would benefit from reading C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity. A great read for someone who's exploring Christian faith. Many of you in this room have probably read this. He writes, almost certainly God is not in time. His life does not consist of moments following one another. If 1 million people are praying to him at 10:30 tonight, he need not listen to them all in that one little snippet which we call 10:30. 10:30 and every other moment from the beginning of the world is always present to him. He has all eternity in which to listen to the split second of prayer put up by a pilot as his plane crashes into flames. God, I believe, does not live in a time series at all. His life is not dribbled out moment by moment like ours. With him, it is, so to speak, still 1920 and already 1960. Of course, C.S. Lewis is writing previous to 1960 at this point. For his life is himself. If you picture time as a straight line along which we have to travel, then you must picture God as the whole page on which the line is drawn. We come to the parts of the line one by one. We have to leave A behind before we get to B, and we cannot reach C until we leave B behind. God, from above or outside or all around, contains the whole line and sees it all. Stephen Hawking's error is to conceive that God is like us and he is bound in time. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Bible, the God of Moses, the God who has revealed himself in Christ, exists outside of time. He is the I am. I just am, God says. I always am. 100 years ago, I am. 1,000 years ago, I am. 1,000 years in the future, I am. I am. Your time is irrelevant to me. All of your time is this to me. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So actually, your failures, your feelings of insecurity, your feelings of inadequacy, your feelings of whatever they might happen to be, in large part have an irrelevance to my call on you. Because I already know the entirety. I've known the end of the story from the beginning of the story. And my call is not contingent upon your performance. My call is contingent upon my will. I knew you would fail before you were even born. Because I am there. I am there when you're born. I am there when you fail. I am there when you die. I am everywhere in between. And that's what matters. And God has a call for each of us. So far, we've been thinking mostly about the call in terms of what is God calling you to do in a way of serving his mission and ministry in the world. Moses had a call to serve the mission and ministry of God in liberating the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt. And God might have a particular call on your life because of who you are and where you've been situated. Not to liberate an entire people group from slavery, but maybe to liberate one person you love from sin and judgment. Or maybe that call is to become a disciple of Jesus's. Maybe that call is you've been coming to church for a while, or maybe you've given church a chance this morning for the first time in a long time. Something piqued your curiosity. What is this strange thing that are my neighbors going to a building on a Sunday morning to sing songs and hear from the Bible and take communion? I shall see it. And God calls you by name. And you think, Peter, that's fine for you to say, but you don't know the things I've done. I don't, and I don't need to, because God does, and God's the one calling. You don't know my life today. No, I don't. And I don't need to, because God is the one calling. And he does. And it may just be that the call this morning for you is the call to repentance and faith. Not just to take up a chair, eat some bread and drink some wine, sip some wine, but to take up your cross, an instrument of shame. How embarrassed might you be to take the name Christian meaningfully, to take God's name upon you, but not in vain, not meaninglessly. What might it mean for you to take up your cross to follow Jesus this morning? What might it mean for you in your discipleship, who you are, where you are, when you are, to embrace the potential embarrassment of sharing a verbal message of the gospel with someone you love and someone you know? Your past failures are irrelevant. Your present things that you might think disqualify you are irrelevant. God's call is. And I would invite us all to take part in the God who is, to hear his call and to respond in faith and obedience.